Good evening. Welcome to the first live general election debate in the race for city controller. I'm Errol Lewis, and I'm joined in tonight's debate by Brian Lehrer, the host of WNYC's Brian Lehrer Show. The next 60 minutes will be an uninterrupted conversation about issues where you will get a chance to learn more about the two major candidates seeking to become our city's next controller. The controller is the city's chief fiscal officer who oversees more than $130 billion invested in the city's pension funds. The controller also reviews and certifies government contracts and audits city agencies to ensure dollars are being spent wisely and that agency goals are being met. Tonight's debate is part of New York's official debate program for the 2013 elections, administered by the New York City Campaign Finance Board. The board manages the city's public matching funds program, which is designed to strengthen the role of average New Yorkers and their small dollar contributions in city elections. The CFB selects partners to bring these debates to New Yorkers, and tonight's debate is sponsored by New York One News, New York One Noticias, Citizens Union of the City of New York, the Hispanic Federation, the Citizens Committee for New York City, Gothamist, Transportation Alternatives, WNYC, and Time Warner Cable. So without further ado, let's introduce the two candidates. They are Scott Stringer and John Burnett. The candidates will have 1 minute to respond to questions that are asked to them, and will also be given the opportunity to respond if they are addressed directly by their opponent. We'll also have what we call a cross-examination, where each candidate will be able to ask his opponent a question. And of course, there will be a lightning round in the middle of the debate, in which candidates will only be allowed to give a one-word answer, usually yes or no, to each question. And there will be 1 minute closing statements as well. I should also note that our Twitter hashtag is hashtag NYC2013. So with all of that out of the way, we are ready to begin. By the flip of a coin, we determine that Scott Stringer will get the first question from Brian Lehrer.
Thanks, Errol. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you both know we live in partisan times. You know what's going on in Washington and around the country. And yet Mayor LaGuardia once famously said, "There's no Democratic or Republican way to pick up the garbage," referring to city services. I wonder if you think there's a Democratic or Republican way to be the controller, Mr. Stringer.
Well, one would think that in these times that one could simply be nonpartisan, but it certainly doesn't feel that way as we debate tonight. The Republicans in Washington have a real agenda coming out of Washington, and that's to put cities like New York out of business. The glooming government shutdown, the debt crisis that we face is very real. And we have to respond as New York City elected officials to say that this can't be allowed to happen. Look what's happened since the partial shutdown. 26,000 New Yorkers have been furloughed. We're already contemplating cuts to important programs. Auditing of Sandy, which I think the next controller has to do. There has to be Sandy money coming to New York. That's in jeopardy. The Republican Congress, by virtue of their actions, are about to shut down the international, national, and city markets. And I do think this is a conversation that we have to have, because there are real differences facing us and facing our candidacy as it relates to this.
Let me jump in for a second and follow up, because we will come back later in the debate to what you think about what's going on in Washington with respect to the debt ceiling and all of that. But with respect to New York City, is there a Democratic and Republican way to do the job of New York City controller?
Well, the job of New York City controller is to watch out for the backs of working people, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, whether they live on Staten Island or Manhattan, wherever you live. The job of the controller is to protect the pensions of all people, regardless of party affiliation. The job of controller is to make sure that we protect people regardless of where they come from or what their ideology is. And that's how I've approached government service. I'm a progressive Democrat, but I recognize that we have to take care of all children and that we have to govern with everybody. I will tell you, though, it has been unfortunate over the years where there seems to be no time for governing between Republicans and Democrats, because if you see what's playing out on the national level, it does trickle down to the states and to the cities. And I would like to go to a time when we can have a real discussion and actually do the kind of governing that's necessary. I've been able to do that as an assembly member.
And let me jump in for time, and we'll come back to that later with respect to Washington. Mr. Burnett, is there a Democratic or Republican way to be a controller of New York City?
To simply answer the question, no. There's no difference. One, I think the controller, more than any other publicly elected official, requires a specific discipline in knowing how to invest money and how to monitor those investments. I have the experience. I think that would be the only requirement, not political affiliation. Money is money. At the end of the day, people will vote for the person that they believe that has the experience and that has the ability to connect with them. to understand what they go through on a daily basis. When it comes down to making a living, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. You're interested in how much taxes you pay, whether you're a homeowner, how much your rent is going up if you don't own a home, what type of environment your children are growing in, what type of education is going to be available to them, both during elementary school all the way up to high school, as well as higher level of education. So I think at the end of the day, people will focus on who is experienced and who is a political hack.
But to follow up for just a moment, and maybe you just started to suggest it with that last attack, you come from Wall Street in terms of your career, which has certain kinds of values and relationships to money. Mr. Stringer, you come from a career in government, which has other kinds of values and missions. Do they not affect your orientation to the money, the investments, the audits, the role of government in people's lives, Mr. Burnett?
Let me answer that. When you look at the composition of CEOs on Wall Street, some of them are Republican, some of them are Democrat. But at the end of the day, the shareholders don't care about your political affiliation. They care about the return and how you're managing that corporation. At the end of the day, it's about the investment.
Mr. Stringer.
I'm very proud of my 20 years of government service. I think the job of controller is not to be a day trader, but to be a very strong manager. It's a job that requires you to manage 750 individuals, $76 million budget. There's many facets to the controller's office. One is audit and investigation. As borough president, I issued 50 investigative reports rooting out waste to make our economy better and to make our people stronger. As a member of the NYSERS Pension Fund, I worked as a fiduciary on that fund, working to ensure the financial security of the people who have pension investments. Part of the job of controller is to register contracts, and I have experience by virtue of my role as borough president on a host of these issues. So it's a very interesting job. You have to work collaboratively with the next mayor. I'm going to do that. And you also have to be independent. You have to know where the waste is. You have to know how to investigate city agencies. So it's a very diverse office with great opportunity to serve the public.
Thank you.
Well, can I respond to that?
We'll give you more than enough time to do that. I'd like you both, because although you've been campaigning a lot, there are a lot of our viewers who don't necessarily know very much about you. I'd like you both to describe a little bit your qualifications and what makes you especially well suited to hold the job of controller, and in particular, what do you offer that your opponent does not? And we'll start with you, Mr. Burnett.
Well, I offer, I offer experience. I have 23 years experience in financial services in the areas of operations, risk management, governance, policy, and regulatory examinations, and last but not least, audit. I think it's very important to have those skills. When you look at the last several years, we've been through tumultuous times. It's very important to make sure that the person that is hired, that you hire someone with the right type of experience. You're not going to go into a doctor's office or a lawyer or an accountant and someone that doesn't have experience when you need it. So I think it's very important. My opponent, he touts serving on the NYSERS board as a trustee, but he hasn't been there in 3 years. The last 3 consecutive years, he has yet to attend a board meeting. How can you actually manage or have the expectation to actually run all 5 pension boards, manage a portfolio of approximately $140 billion, and you don't even show up? Secondly, you have no experience in auditing. You've been in politics for 25 years, and you owe a ton of favors. I'm surprised you still even have your own soul. Maybe I shouldn't be presumptuous. Maybe you actually sold that off a long time ago.
Well, it was more about your qualifications, but obviously he's going to want to respond.
Well, I don't think we have to comment on my soul. It seems to be in good shape. My wife thinks so. My 2 little boys do so. But let me get to, obviously, let me just clear up a couple of things. And this is why government service does matter in this job. The controller doesn't go to the pension fund meetings, and neither do any of the principals of the trustee. The only elected official to go to those meetings has been me. Why? Because when I became borough president, I wanted to learn every facet of the job. So I spent time trying to understand and meet the fiduciaries of the fund. But the reality is, between my counsel and myself, We've gone to 100% of those meetings, and we've done real work on those funds. We've protected the retirement security of 650,000 individuals. We've helped codify conferences and other issues relating to emerging managers. We worked on issues of climate change and pension investment and shareholder resolutions that qualified me to be controller. On the auditing side, the Daily News said very clearly that my investigative reports qualified me to be the chief auditor for this city because they were compelling and they went to the issues that New Yorkers care about, like the NYCHA housing developments and broken elevators that we blew the whistle, or the outside consulting contracts at the Department of Education. This is real work I did. Yes, government work, but it was work that made a difference in people's lives. And so part of coming from a Wall Street background and a great story, I commend you, is that when you don't have an understanding of how the agencies or the pension fund works, it does put you at a disadvantage. Because let me tell you something, if you're a controller, you're not going to go to those NYSERS board meetings. You're going to be having to appoint very good people to represent you because, again, it's a 750 person office. There's many facets to the office. It's not just the pension fund. It's the FCRC, the FCRC committee where we do the concessions. There's a whole host of other boards, the IDA board that you sit on. And I have had experience at each of those levels of government, not to mention my experience in Albany, where I had to deal with both Republicans and Democrats as a member of the State Assembly.
Okay.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm surprised you actually told a blatant lie on New York One. You haven't attended.
I think it's a blatant lie.
No, you have not attended a NYSER board meeting in 3 years.
I did
and
lie.
let me finish. Your overall record, you've only attended 15 out of the last 160 board meetings. And you said that the controller doesn't have to show up. Well, when I'm controller, I'm going to show up because we have to spend $8 billion of taxpayer money to make up the shortfall because the pension funds are not properly being managed.
Okay, so
let me finish. That's partly the reason why. And I doubt if you even show up during the Borough, Manhattan community board meetings, you just don't show up. You're a failure.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, looking at some of the work, because I think the original question is what do I bring to this office? In addition to my work on the pension fund, in addition to my work on the FCRC, Franchise Concession Review Committee, in addition to my work on the ADA board, and as well as managing the 600 members of the community boards, I also served as a former chair of the Real Property Taxation Committee when I was in Albany. I took on the real property taxation scandal, passed legislation, held hearings, cleaned that up. In Albany, I challenged the leadership of my own party. This goes back to bipartisan issues. I challenged the Democrats and said, look, the Brennan Center for Justice calls Albany dysfunctional. Let's try to clean it up. So I was one of the leaders in passing a resolution to make sure that we ended empty seat voting, forcing legislators to be in their seats. That's why during the primary, the Times, Daily News, Post, Amsterdam News, Jewish Press said that I was qualified to be controller because I had a record of integrity, experience, and leadership.
Okay, we're going to leave that question there for now. Brian's got a new question.
In the Democratic primary debate that Errol and I moderated, you and Eliot Spitzer talked a lot about using the office as a progressive force, either in the kinds of audits that you did that might be policy oriented, as well as looking to see if the books were honest and balanced, as well as looking to be kind of a cop over corporate governance in the companies that the pension fund invested in. I wonder how much, now that Spitzer's out of the race, you want to pick up that mantle by yourself and say that's going to be one of the defining features of a Scott Stringer controller legacy, and then we'll hear from Mr. Burnett how much he would.
Well, the five funds, the $140 billion pension fund, the NYSERS fund in particular, has a proud history of holding corporations accountable and to very high standards. We divested from companies that do business in South Africa in the 80s. We have played this role nationally, and I do think there's a place for the 6th largest institutional investor in the nation and the 14th largest in the world to continue to make companies stronger. And what I said during the primary, and I still believe this, that part of looking at companies and making them better through voting shares, tying executive compensation to actual executive work, et cetera, is because when we make companies better, we grow our pension fund. We hit our actuarial targets.
And how about with respect to audits? Are there are there city agencies that you have on your radar screen as ones that you really want to see how those books are, either because you're suspicious of how they're run financially or to affect certain kinds of policy changes?
Well, the charter says you audit all city agencies, so that is part of the portfolio, and I will build a audit department that will be the envy of the nation. I have, as I mentioned, my 50 executive reports in a lot of ways has done this kind of work, impacting policy, but also rooting out waste. I again refer to the Department of Education outside consultants. My work has been holding New York City Public Housing Authority accountable. We went through 3,720 elevator inspection reports. I found that elevators failed 75% of the time, but here's what I was able to do. I worked with Senator Schumer, and we were able to get federal stimulus money and redirect money to fix elevators. So part of an audit, to me, is not just to play gotcha or to get your name in the paper. Part of the audit function is to change policy, make the bureaucracy better, and where you find fraud, you certainly refer to the appropriate authorities.
Mr. Burnett, would you also use the power to audit to try to make policy better, not just to see if the books were honest and balanced?
I think that my first focus would be on New York City. To specifically answer your question, I would focus on Department of Education and Economic Development. And as Mr. Stringer had pointed out, I would cascade down to other New York City agencies to make sure that their spending is accurate, to make sure that there's no other improprieties, and making sure that they're adhering to all the policies, rules, and regulations. Same thing I did in corporate America. Mr. Stringer had said repeatedly that, I guess he's an elevator expert by now. He issued so many reports on that. I think you have to take a broad look and see pretty much where the other issues lie besides what you feel in your gut. That's the reason why the first day, what I would like to do is launch a citywide risk assessment. Come in with fresh ideas to see pretty much where the issues are besides what have been noted in previous reports. And speaking of those audit reports, what I like to do, I've read many of them, and they don't have corrective action plans. They just state what's wrong, why it's wrong, and no recommendations for remediation going forward. How do you have accountability if there's no expectation with a definitive timeline and who's responsible for correcting those issues?
If he's got a reputation for focusing on the elevators in public housing, is there anything you would like to have that similar reputation for after your first year in office?
I'm not here to talk about what type of reputation I want to build, other than doing a good job across the board. I want to make sure that the city agencies are being audited the way they should be, with the correct remediation plan and corrective action plans. I want to make sure that the pension fund is being managed effectively, with me actually attending board meetings to make sure that it's moving in the right direction, as well as all city agency contracts are being registered properly. There's a lot of cronyism, a lot of contracts are being doled out to family and friends that are ballooned into these big payments to family and friends at the compromise of good investment in education and other public safety issues.
Very briefly, anything to respond to there? 30 seconds.
I actually agree with John. I think part of an audit is not just to do a gotcha assessment, but a risk assessment. And we would certainly, if I was controller, look at ways for that agency to save money if it was a money issue. I also think that we have to be mindful that as we audit agencies, we also should look for ways to make government more responsive to the needs of the people.
Okay, we're going to move now to the cross-examination. That's where each candidate gets a chance to ask a question of his opponent. Scott Stringer, you go first.
John, it's good to be with you at this debate. Look, we're facing a almost a national emergency as relates to the potential for a government shutdown next week. 26,000 people have been furloughed in New York City. Essential programs, nutrition programs are in jeopardy. We have, as you may be aware, a $40 billion fixed income security stake in the federal government that could potentially be in jeopardy if the federal government defaults on their loans. You're running as the Republican candidate. You're also running as the conservative candidate, but as the Republican candidate, what do you say to the people of New York City today that your party is shutting down the government and trying to put urban America out of business, especially our city, where the hardship would be devastating, all because your party does not want to see 927,000 people get insurance from the Affordable Care Act?
first off, there's two things pretty much that's on the table with respect to Obamacare. The first one is making sure that there's no tax on medical devices. I'm not too sure if you were aware of that. When each time a medical device or any manufacturing product is taxed, you run the risk of those jobs being shipped overseas, number one, because as costs rise, they'll seek other ways, possibly overseas, to produce that product at cheaper costs. So that way we lose union jobs. Secondly, with respect to the other issue with regard to delaying it 1 year, I think that that's reasonable. However, unlike my Republican counterparts, I would not have held the country hostage. Now, I'm not here to play the blame game, but when you look at a president, the president ran on his ability to bring about collaboration, his ability on bipartisanship, but he says that he doesn't want to negotiate. I think those two things are reasonable. I think introducing something new like Affordable Care Act throughout this entire nation and wanting to delay the mandatory requirement that might hit or disadvantage many families with respect to that, I think that was a fair request. But here you are trying to infuse division between Republicans and Democrats. I hear that constantly on the campaign trail. After people hear my platform, they really begin to see that there's no difference between Republican and Democrat with respect to the Comptroller's office. Let me finish.
Okay.
Let me finish. You know, we have to get out of this gang-like mentality, Crips versus Bloods. Bottom line, we're all Americans. We need to come to the table, sit down, negotiate, and work out a plan to make sure that families are strong and worry about the real issues. You know, I have yet to hear any politician on this campaign trail talk about jobs in New York City and talk about the education that's poor. You know, education in the street game leads to poverty and high incarceration rates.
We're going to get to that.
John, the only thing I would say is it's wrong to delay the Affordable Care Act. There are too many people in our city who need insurance now. And the truth of the matter
They have
is,
the option.
I let you finish. I let you finish.
No,
Let
no,
me finish.
They have the option.
Let me finish.
They have the option to go and buy it. The only thing that was on the table is to remove the mandatory requirement. They didn't stop Obamacare. That's a point of clarification.
The Republicans want to stop the Affordable Care Act. That's what this
We're talking
government
about
shut
the
down.
bill.
That's
we're
what
talking
this
about the bill.
Listen,
We're
it's a
talking about
debate,
the
so you have to
bill.
let me talk so then you can talk.
No, but you have to get
I'll
your
wait.
facts correct.
Let him get his.
Do you mind?
Scott.
I know you're new at this. Part of what this is about is stopping Obamacare. Part of what this is about is shutting down the government. The Republicans are taking us to the edge. This is hurting our international and national markets, whether it's Spain, Greece, or places around the world. They are looking at the Republican Congress and saying, what is going on? Now, I will tell you, as someone who wants to be controller, this is very serious for New York City. Cutting programs, putting us on the edge, we could plunge into a recession again. We could hurt the slow road back. And I would say to your Republican friends in Congress that this is not the way to treat cities like New York. We are the engine, the economic engine of this city. And this shutdown is very serious.
John Burnett, let me ask you to very quickly end this discussion and then ask your question.
Okay. The thing is, my opponent is trying to lump me in the same bucket as all Republicans. That's like me saying that he goes around taking pictures and tweeting his private parts because Anthony Weiner did it. That's like saying that he goes around with hookers because some other Democrat did it. That makes no sense. I'm John Burnett. I'm running on my own merit.
Fair enough. Ask your question, John Burnett.
You know, in tumultuous financial times that we could potentially face, how would interest rates, when it comes to risk and interest rates, affect the capital asset pricing model with respect to various investments and its potential impact in the pension fund?
Well, I think obviously any wave in that market placement would have an impact. So, for example, you raise a very good point. When you look at the pension fund right now, obviously when you shut down the government, you default on loans, it's going to have an impact on our pension fund as well. We have $40 billion invested.
Let me remind you, the question is regarding the capital asset pricing model.
And I'm talking about the capital assets that we have, which is $140 billion. I'll answer the question my way. You ask the question your way.
So you don't know? Okay.
No, let me answer the question. I let you answer the question.
So you have to attend board meetings in order to know.
Right now, we have $40 billion that's placed there. It used to be a place of great security. If we default and the Republicans don't let go, we're obviously going to cause real hardship for this city. And that's something that we cannot allow to happen. Now, the truth is, John, you can't get away from being a Republican because you agree with them.
No,
you think we should delay Obamacare. You criticize our president. You say he's not a negotiator when everyone in New York City is surprised that the Republicans are taking this tack.
Hold on, I did not say that we need to delay Obamacare. All I said is two things.
You did say
the mandatory requirement. I think the Obamacare, or I should say Affordable Care Act, should move forward. Those two things are reasonable. It should be optional, at least for the first year. That's my opinion. And then secondly, the more we tax manufacturing in the country, the more jobs will be going overseas. And let me answer my own question. With regard to the capital asset pricing model, as risk change and the risk-free rate change, of course, assets will actually be priced differently. It's a real simple answer. With respect to the government shutdown, if the government actually shuts down and everything collapses, the whole world collapses. They're not going to let that happen. That's common sense.
That's a prediction. You're predicting no default?
John, I hope you're right, but the question is, why did it come to this?
Because the capital asset pricing model starts with the risk-free rate. The global risk-free rate is government bonds, U.S. government bonds.
We've got a question.
That will never happen.
We've got a question.
That's ridiculous.
On that very topic of the federal shutdown.
You tell the senior citizens, the young people in our country right now, if it's ridiculous, they don't think so.
That's right. For my next question, I want to try to relate what's going on in Washington specifically to New York City. The federal debt ceiling could be breached without the government going into default, say some Republicans, including Senator Ted Cruz. So, Mr. Burnett, specifically, I wonder if, as a Republican and a Wall Street person, you agree with Senator Cruz and others making this argument that we could miss the deadline next Thursday, October 17th, and still not go into default. And do you fear for New York City in particular ways if the federal debt ceiling deadline is missed?
Well, number one, I believe that the Affordable Care Act will move forward, and it should move forward.
But that's a separate issue, the shutdown and the Affordable Care Act, separate issue.
Let me finish. So I just want to go back, right? So I'm answering the question.
Go ahead.
So I think that it will move forward, and it should. The mandatory requirement is the only thing that should be delayed, deferred. I don't think that, I think that we should raise the debt ceiling at this point in juncture. We haven't, the real problem is that we haven't had an approved budget in several years. I think that's the issue. We don't know what we're raising the debt limit, but yet we don't know what we're spending it on. We're constantly incurring new expenses without growth opportunities. You know, if Scott Stringer gets into office, he's going to actually move to raise taxes. That's going to kill jobs here in New York City and have a greater impact on people with respect to, you know, their livelihood. They're already finding, you know, it hard to find a job. Many people that have been laid off over the last several years and found employment, they're underemployed, making less than they made before. So I think that we need to focus on New York City's economy and do what we need to do. You know, the contracts haven't been negotiated in several years. You know, that has yet to come up tonight. We haven't had that situation where all contracts expired since 1975.
And we're going to get to that. Do you agree with Senator Cruz, yes or no?
No.
That the debt ceiling being breached would not necessarily put the government into default?
Listen, we shouldn't use harmful negotiating tactics. You know, the whole world is watching just like they watch everything else. So goes the U.S., so goes the world.
All right.
So I think that, number one, you know, I think that we should continue to sit down with the president and show him the due respect and ask, you know, what is the best way forward to see how they can actually work their way around the mandatory requirement while still moving Obamacare forward and possibly, you know, reconsidering the tax on medical devices. Medical devices are already too expensive for the elderly and the sick that need it.
All right, Mr. Stringer, your turn on potential effects on New York of default.
So let me answer the question. I think the impact on New York could be potentially very devastating. Senator Schumer shares this view, as does very responsible New York City lawmakers. Whether it's Mayor Bloomberg or Senator Gillibrand, everyone agrees that the Republican gamemanship in Washington has gone too far, and it's now time to pull back. John's right, 100%. As goes the U.S., so goes the world. And we are not just playing politics in Washington. This is an issue that is impacting us in the international markets, nationally. I can tell you in New York City, we have people furloughed, people suddenly without work, sitting at home, wondering when they're going to get their next paycheck. We have a whole host of issues relating to students and seniors, nutrition programs in this city that are starting to be dismantled. We have a very precarious financial situation in this city, and this is happening at the same time we're about to constitute a new government, a new mayor, controller, public advocate. That's why government experience matters now, because we're also going to have to keep an eye on those Republicans in Washington. And I will tell you that the national elections are looking at New York City. They're looking at this mayoral election. And I will tell you, the voters will not stand for a Republican Congress that's going to hurt the Affordable Care Act, that will shut down the government when we should be putting government to work for the people. And that's what I've done in my public career, from Albany to New York City. And that's something that matters to me and matters to my kids and the children around the city.
The 1% tax that Bill de Blasio and Scott Stringer are proposing will actually have more of a detrimental impact on New York City than what he's talking about right now. We have a 14% unemployment in the Black and Hispanic communities, still 5 years after the debacle. You know, the zoning requirements, just looking at Manhattan alone, the rezoning has impacted several jobs. The rezoning, along with the 20% increase in commercial real estate and multiple family dwellings, has impacted rents. And that's the reason why rent has skyrocketed, because of decisions like Scott Stringer. So while he's talking about Republicans in Washington, which I disagree with, you know, in terms of the way they're going about holding the country hostage, when you look at the record that he's touting, he's one of the reasons why rent has skyrocketed.
I actually read that you were for the Midtown rezoning, so it's interesting you changed your mind.
No, that's a blatant lie. I haven't even published that.
I'll check. That's what I read.
Yeah, you better check.
Okay. So the issue for me as it relates to the New York City economy, is to get back on track once we deal with this Republican shutdown and this Republican issue. Is we should talk about the post Wall Street economy, because I believe that we're never going to quite get back to where we were with Wall Street when the crash happened. So we have to think about ways to create new economies. One way to do that is to deal with the high-tech economy, which has grown in the city 60% in the last 10 years. And I've worked very hard in making sure that we have a plan and a protocol to make sure our kids are trained for this new exciting economy, where entry-level jobs pay $60,000 and $70,000 a year, coder jobs, programmer jobs. These are the issues that we should be discussing, Brian. But you know what's happening? Washington is putting us in crisis mode, where we can't get to the real issues that a Mayor de Blasio is going to have to deal with.
And now we're going to get to the issue with Errol of the city's own potential debt problems. So,
as was mentioned, most of the city's unionized employees are working on expired contracts, and estimates of what it will cost to settle those contracts, if you include retroactive pay, have run as high as $7 billion or more. We're going to start with you, Mr. Stringer. Take us through your analysis of how to deal with the political and financial issues involved in resolving that.
Well, look, we have 152 labor contracts that have been expired for 3 to 5 years. That's a very serious situation to be in. The next mayor must begin a collective bargaining agreement with all the labor unions, figure out what the pattern ought to be, and get to the bargaining table. Negotiating these contracts in the media has been a big failure, because we've not negotiated one contract over the last 5 years. So that's step one. Now, what should the controller do? The controller has a couple of roles. The first is, when I'm controller, I'm going to make it very clear what we can afford and what we can't afford, so that we bring labor and the next mayor, in this case it'll be Bill de Blasio, together, so we can make sure our workers get the compensation they deserve, but at the same time we also operate within the constraints of our budget. Second, The Comptroller and I will do this on day one. We're going to reduce the fees we pay to these wealthy money managers in the pension system. $400 million a year we're paying out to his friends on Wall Street. I'm going to reduce the money we pay to those wealthy money managers, and then I'm going to sit down with the 58 trustees of the 5 pension funds and begin to talk about real pension reform, making those pension funds work closely together so we can make better, timely investments, so we can reduce the $1 billion that it costs to operate those 5 funds. I will do that because I have the skill set based on my 20 years of negotiating, whether it's 3 university expansions or other rezonings. I have the skill set, the relationships, and the ability to get that reform. That reform was started by Mayor Bloomberg and John Liu in 2011. I supported it back then, but I also recognize that in order to achieve this, you need to have consensus, and then you need to get approval in Albany. And I believe that at this moment in time, this is the skill set that I can reduce the money managers and the pension.
Before Mr. Burnett gives his response, just to clarify, do you think that retroactive pay increases are on or off the table? Your preliminary analysis of where we are?
I think, we don't know what the exact numbers are until we have a new mayor and we see what's in OMB. Obviously, we are in a tight budget situation, but I believe for the new mayor, everything should be on the table. I'm not going to impede a Mayor de Blasio and and negotiate in the media, even in a debate, because I think this is one of the defining issues that face the mayor, and I will tell you why. The mayor and the Comptroller, we have to go to the rating agencies, Fitch and S&P, Moody's. We have to go and make a case for the city's 4-year financial plan. And there's no doubt in my mind that those rating agencies are going to say, where are these labor contracts? How can you plan and forecast a budget if you can't get that whole? So I believe this is an incredibly important moment for labor, for our workers, and for our city.
Mr. Burnett.
First off, I have family members that work for the city, so I want to make sure that the holidays go quite well. So I think as my opponent mentioned, I think that's the first order of business coming into the Comptroller's office, working with the next mayor, hopefully Loda, to make sure that people get what they deserve in terms of the hard work that they've been doing over the last 4 years, and the hard work that we expect of them going forward, to make sure that they have a good contract. As he also pointed out, not too sure with respect to retroactive pay. I've been educating people on the taxation that's involved with retroactive pay. It's considered a bonus, and bonuses are taxed at 48.6%. And when they heard that, they went running. So I said, why actually start lobbying for retroactive pay when half of it will be gone? So let's actually, not to say that it should be taken off the table, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about how healthcare costs are going to be kept down. Healthcare costs are due to rise another 40%. We want to make sure that healthcare stays consistent and make sure that they get a fair contract going forward over the next 4 years. With respect to the pension fund, we also have to talk about that. The pension fund has, we contribute about $8 billion a year. The healthcare cost is approximately another $5 billion. And then when you look at our dependency on debt, that has increased 86% over the last 10 years. And we have an annual interest expense of $6 billion. So when you add all that up, that equals what we're spending on education before we turn on the lights or turn the key.
Well, talk briefly about how you would handle those large structural challenges.
Yeah, but that affects how much we spend and have available to negotiate for contracts, how much we spend and have available for education.
Do you have a plan on how to get some control over those health costs and some of those other expenses you just took?
Yeah, I'd like to start a healthcare trust fund. Right now we have a pay-as-you-go policy, so we have no way to stay ahead of the rising healthcare costs. So we have $122 billion, approximately $122 billion underfunded pension. So we have to contribute $8 billion or more over the next X number of years until the market catches up. So I think I'm not even sure that if Scott Stringer even knew that. So I think it's very important. I think you didn't mention it. You didn't mention it. Well, so the point is we have to make sure that the pension is properly being managed, because it's creating a crowd-out effect. The moment that we stop investing in education, public safety, parks, recreation, things that New York City residents have grown to love and enjoy, then it's not making New York City a place to really live and live comfortably.
Brief follow-up on the same issue, the big-ticket items, the large structural deficit
Look,
issues.
in 2001, we used to pay $1.2 billion into the fund. We're now paying $8 to $9 billion. That's certainly not sustainable. The pension consolidation plan, making more timely investments, reducing the bureaucracy within the fund is one of my ways of doing this. Reducing the wealthy money managers involved in making investments. We clearly have to get that reduced. That's just a ripoff. The third thing we have to do is we have to build out our asset management bureau. A lot of big institutional investors are now starting to recognize it's better and cheaper to do this work in-house. And we've already had this discussion, as a fiduciary of the pension fund. This has been something that has been discussed, but I would certainly look to do that. That's on the controller side of the aisle. On the mayoral aisle, I still go back to the fact that we have to have a robust and important collective bargaining process with the next mayor. I'm going to work with Bill de Blasio to make sure that the administration gets off on the right foot on these issues. I want to be a partner in that. I think this is not a time to play politics. I will say one more time, because it's so timely in the situation that we face. Look, what hurts us now is what they're doing in Washington. And if we don't get that right, a lot of what we're trying to do, reduce pension costs, settle this economy, make way for a new mayor with new ideas on education, all of that is in jeopardy if we allow this Republican right-wing agenda to go forth in this country.
Next question is from Brian.
A controller needs to be independent in order to do effective audits and projections. You have both supported the top of your respective tickets tonight, Bill de Blasio and Joe Lhota. I wonder, to demonstrate your independence, if either of you could identify any particular potential fiscal red flags that the mayoral candidates are running on. Mr. Stringer, maybe some of the taxes and spending Mr. de Blasio is proposing. Mr. Burnett, maybe some of the tax cuts that Mr. Lhota is proposing and their potential impacts on revenue. Mr. Burnett, anything?
Well, actually, in one of the debates in the Democratic primary, the 1% tax that came up, and Eliot Spitzer, with his experience as governor and attorney general, had said that would never pass in Albany. I did my own research, and I think he's right. I think that would actually create a worse situation with respect to our job growth here in New York City, which has been lackluster. In fact, Governor Cuomo has tapped Governor Pataki, as well as former State Comptroller Carl McCall, to figure out tax-cutting strategies. So how is Bill de Blasio going to push through a 1% tax increase through the legislature?
We'll get Mr. Stringer to respond to that in a minute, but the question was, would you identify any red flags from the candidate of your own party?
I'm not against disagree. Like I said before, I disagree with the way the Republicans in Washington have handled.
I'm just talking about Joe Lhota's proposals.
Let me finish. When he mentions Washington, you don't interrupt. So let me just make this quick point and transition to Joe Lhota. I disagree with the way it's been handled in Washington, wholeheartedly. Let's be clear on that. With respect to Joe Lhota, I don't have any issue with disagreeing with anyone. We all don't have to sing Kumbaya, hold each other, and so forth. We're all professionals, and we're all coming to the table with New York City in the best interest in our minds and hearts. So I think that whatever tax proposal, after I do my own research and group of my 700 employees do their research and impact analysis, if it shows up where, New York City everyday workers are going to be impacted, or the taxpayers or the unions will be impacted, I'll be the first one to raise my hand.
And Mr. Stringer, without mentioning Washington, any concerns you have about Mr. de Blasio's proposals?
I want to help him out. Maybe you can comment on Joe Lhota's gun proposal that it should be made easy to get handguns in the city, but you don't have to answer that. Let me talk about the de Blasio issue. It's not a 1% tax, so I don't want people tomorrow to think that, oh my God, everyone's taxes are going up. His proposal is to tax the wealthy among us, and that proposal has obviously been very controversial, but I got to tell you something what I like about this guy de Blasio. when he puts forth a plan, he talks about how he's going to pay for it. I was at that Abney breakfast, and he talked about work he wanted to do at CUNY. He put a price tag on that, too. And as a potential controller, it's heartening to see a mayoral candidate talk about how we're going to pay for things and how he's going to get there. Now, I know you've read about Albany, but I actually served in Albany. I chaired the cities committee. And I was there when the Republicans and the Democrats did away with the commuter tax, which has cost this city $750 million a year. We've never been whole since we've lost that commuter tax in 1999. Now, I'm going to talk to Mayor de Blasio about talking about a strategy to bring back the commuter tax, because I think suburbanites should leave a couple of bucks behind to pay for fire and police and for sanitation. And then I want to take that commuter tax and use it to build out a 5-borough transportation plan.
But nothing that he's saying makes you think, oh, I have to keep an eye on this de Blasio proposal.
What I want to be able to do is work with the next speaker and the city council to work with the next mayor to come up with a series of proposals, because I actually think that part of what we should do, and I proposed this 2 years ago, is we also have to be mindful that there's a struggling middle class in this city, and they're having trouble, and we need a middle class tax cut. And one of the things that Andrew Cuomo was able to do by expanding the tax brackets, letting the very wealthy have a change in their taxable adjustments, we could give a tax cut to 90% of the people who are the middle class in the city. And that won't solve every problem, but it would help with some car payments, some new clothes for the kids, and we should think about that as well.
All right, no daylight with either of the mayoral candidates tonight. Errol?
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to start the lightning round. That's where we ask the candidates a series of questions, and they generally will only be able to answer yes or no to each question. We're going to start with Brian.
And we'll go back and forth as to who gets the first answer. Mr. Stringer, do you belong to any private clubs?
No.
Mr. Burnett?
No.
Mr. Burnett, have you ever belonged to a labor union?
Yes.
Have you?
No.
Have you ever spent more than $1,000 on a suit, Mr. Stringer?
Once.
Mr.
Never.
Burnett? We're getting some surprising, counterintuitive answers here. At what level did the Dow Jones Industrial Average close today, Mr. Burnett?
I know it was well below 15,000.
Mr. Stringer?
It's not well below, but below 15,000.
At what level did the Dow Jones Industrial Average close today?
We lost a couple hundred points, I think.
Mr. Stringer, should the federal government bail out Detroit?
No.
Should they?
No.
Have you given money, Mr. Burnett, to a panhandler in the last month?
Every day.
Mr. Stringer?
Yes.
Do you, Mr. Stringer, personally own stock in Google?
I don't have, I have a deferred comp plan, so I'm not sure.
Mr. Burnett?
Well, being that he only has $72 in investment income, I can answer your question. No. No, I don't own Google, I own Apple.
And has either of you spoken to Elliot Spitzer in the last 2 weeks, Mr. Burnett?
No.
Mr. Stringer?
No.
Okay, Mr. Stringer, have you ever been late paying your rent or mortgage?
Yes.
Mr. Burnett?
No.
Mr. Burnett, without naming names, should someone in the financial sector have gone to jail over the actions that led to the 2008 crash?
Possibly.
Yes.
Mr. Stringer, do you always tip at least 20% in restaurants, even if the service is poor?
Yes.
Mr. Burnett?
My minimum is 18%.
It's honest.
Mr. Burnett, which city neighborhood do you think we will next experience a boom in property values? Not a trick
Probably
question.
Texas.
City neighborhood.
I'm sorry, Houston.
City
New York City.
neighborhood.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was thinking nationally. I think
Not a bad tip anyway, but what's the next hot
tip
neighborhood?
is a bad word when it comes to investments. I think Brooklyn. I think Brooklyn is kind of weird, but I think Brooklyn is the biggest boom when it comes to return on investment.
Mr. Stringer.
I think the South Bronx, parts of the Bronx, I'm betting on Ruben Diaz.
Okay. Mr. Stringer, have you ever bet on a horse and won more than $50?
No.
Mr. Burnett.
I never betted on a horse.
Mr. Burnett, should the city consider allowing longtime public housing residents to purchase their units?
I fully agree with that.
Former resident of public housing. Mr. Stringer.
I think it's too simplistic an answer to answer yes or no. There's a lot of issues related.
I
to
believe in
housing.
ownership, and that's a way to give a person a hand up
Mr. Stringer, how much cash do you withdraw on a typical trip to the ATM?
$100.
Mr. Burnett?
For some reason, I always get 260.
260. Lucky number. Say that tonight. Mr. Burnett, do you have more than $100 in cash in your wallet right now?
Yes.
Mr. Stringer?
No.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Brian and I are now going to ask the candidates some questions for the remainder of the debate as we get closer to our closing statements. If we cut you off, it's because we want to give you full time for your closing statements. Brian.
Thanks, Earl. Another of the jobs of the Comptroller is, of course, to invest the massive city pension funds. And like with investments that families make, you can have more risk tolerance for more possible gains or be more risk averse for the safety of your investments. How would you each